Egypt versus Assyria. The day Egypt lost the Near East. Memphis had stood as Egypt's royal capital for over 2,000 years, and it fell in less than 2 weeks. Not because its walls were weak, and not because its defenders had abandoned their posts. It fell because a force arrived from directions Egypt had long assumed no enemy could survive long enough to reach. In 671 BC, an Assyrian army crossed hundreds of miles of open desert to reach the Nile Delta. Egypt had treated that desert as a natural wall, the kind of barrier that geography provides and armies cannot overcome. The Assyrians overcame it, and when they emerged on the other side, there was nothing standing between them and Memphis. Within days of entering the Delta, Assyrian soldiers were moving through the streets of Egypt's royal capital. The pharaoh's family was taken prisoner, and Egypt's treasuries were opened by foreign hands for the first time ever. A civilization 2,000 years old lost its capital before a relief army could even be assembled. No single moment in Egypt's recorded history was more sudden, more complete, or more difficult to explain afterward. But the strangest part of this story is not what Assyria did to Egypt in 671 BC. The strangest part is that the empire that accomplished all of this was itself completely gone within 60 years. Egypt continued for another 1,000 years after the Assyrians left, still building temples, still crowning pharaohs. Assyria never recovered from its own collapse and left almost nothing behind that functioned as a state. So the real question is not how Assyria managed to conquer the oldest kingdom on earth. The real question is why the conqueror vanished, and the kingdom it conquered kept going. To understand why Egypt's fall was so shocking, you first have to understand what Assyria actually was. The Neo-Assyrian Empire did not rise by accident or luck. It rose through a deliberate and systematic reinvention of warfare itself. Where most ancient armies were seasonal forces, assembled for a campaign and then sent home, Assyria built something different. A professional standing army that existed year-round, trained continuously, and answered only to the king. That distinction mattered enormously in a world where most armies dissolved after each campaign season ended. Assyria's soldiers did not go home to farm and return the following spring with their skills degraded. They trained, they drilled, and they refined the techniques that made Assyrian siegecraft the most advanced in the ancient world. They adopted iron weapons at scale before almost anyone else in the region, giving their soldiers an edge in both cutting power and durability. Iron was not simply a better material. It was a logistical advantage, because the ore was more widely available than the tin and copper needed to produce bronze. An army that could equip itself with iron did not depend on the same fragile trade networks that Bronze Age armies required, and Assyria exploited that independence ruthlessly. They developed siege engineering into a sophisticated discipline, building movable towers and ram systems that could break nearly any fortification. And they understood something that purely military powers often miss: that fear, managed correctly, is more efficient than combat. The Assyrian annals, carved into stone and clay across dozens of royal palaces, were not simply war records. They were psychological documents, written and distributed to spread a very specific message across every kingdom in the region. The message was simple and deliberate. We have done this before, and we will do it again, and resistance changes nothing about the outcome. Entire populations were deported from their homelands and resettled in distant parts of the empire, dissolving local identity and breaking the will to rebel. Cities that resisted were not simply conquered. They were made into examples that the next city in the path of the Assyrian army would be forced to consider. The result was an empire that expanded with unusual speed, not just because of its military strength, but because submission became a rational calculation. By the time Esarhaddon came to the throne in 681 BC, Assyria controlled a territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. Every major power in the Near East had either been absorbed, made into a tributary state, or reduced to irrelevance by Assyrian pressure. Every major power, that is, except one. The Egypt that faced Assyria in the 7th century BC was not the Egypt of Ramses the Great or Thutmose III. By this point, Egypt was ruled by the 25th dynasty, a line of kings who had originated in the kingdom of Kush, in what is now Sudan. The Kushite pharaohs were not weak rulers. They were ambitious, militarily capable, and genuinely committed to restoring Egyptian power and prestige. Pharaoh Taharqa, who came to the throne around 690 BC, was by any measure one of the most formidable rulers Egypt had produced in generations. He built aggressively, restored temples, conducted military campaigns, and projected an image of a restored empire equal to its ancient predecessors. Taharqa's building projects stretched from Nubia to the Delta, and the scale of his investment in temple construction rivaled that of the great pharaohs of earlier centuries. He was not ruling a kingdom in decline. He was ruling a kingdom that genuinely believed it was in the process of restoring its former greatness. But the territory that had once made Egypt a great imperial power, the Levantine city-states and trading ports of the eastern Mediterranean coast, was slipping away. Assyria had been tightening its grip on the Levant for decades, absorbing kingdoms and installing loyal governors in cities that had once looked to Egypt for patronage. Taharqa made a decision that would define his reign and reshape the balance of power across the ancient Near East. He began actively supporting anti-Assyrian rebellions among the remaining independent city-states of the Levant. Egyptian agents, Egyptian resources, and in some cases Egyptian troops were deployed to encourage resistance against Assyrian control. The logic was straightforward. A Levant in revolt was a Levant that Assyria had to manage, rather than a platform from which it could press further south. For Egypt, keeping the Levantine city-states unsettled was a form of strategic depth, a buffer zone maintained through proxy conflict rather than direct presence. But from Assyria's perspective, this Egyptian interference looked very different. It looked like the one power that had avoided submission was now actively working to destabilize the empire's southern frontier. Esarhaddon had spent years consolidating Assyrian control across the region, and he watched Egypt's proxy interference with growing frustration and anger. Every rebellion that Egyptian support fueled meant Assyrian soldiers dying on a frontier that should have been pacified. Every city-state that Egypt encouraged to resist Assyria was a direct challenge to the premise that Assyrian power was absolute. Esarhaddon was not a ruler who tolerated direct challenges to that premise. Invading Egypt was not a decision any Assyrian king had taken lightly, and for good reason. The geography alone was a serious argument against it. Between Assyria's heartland and the Nile Delta lay hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, including the Sinai Desert, one of the most punishing environments in that part of the world. No army could carry sufficient water for the crossing on its own. Supply lines of that length were extraordinarily difficult to maintain and protect. Previous attempts by Assyrian forces to approach Egypt had stumbled and turned back before they even reached the Nile. Sennacherib, Esarhaddon's father, and one of Assyria's most capable military rulers, had confronted Egyptian-backed resistance in the Levant repeatedly and had never moved to invade Egypt directly. That restraint suggested something: that even the most aggressive Assyrian kings recognized Egypt as a different kind of problem. But Esarhaddon was not restrained by the same caution. He had a different assessment of the situation. He had spent years studying the Egyptian problem, watching Taharqa's interference in the Levant, and calculating the true cost of leaving it unaddressed. Every year that Egypt remained beyond Assyrian reach was a year it could continue funding resistance across the empire's entire southern frontier. Esarhaddon concluded that the cost of invasion, however high, was lower than the ongoing cost of tolerating a rival power that operated freely outside his control. He began preparing methodically, securing alliances with Arab tribes who controlled the desert water sources along the Sinai route. The Arab tribal leaders who maintained the wells and cisterns along the desert corridors were, in strategic terms, as important as any regiment of soldiers. Esarhaddon understood this and invested considerable diplomatic effort in ensuring their cooperation before a single soldier left the Assyrian heartland. Without those alliances, no army of sufficient size could cross the Sinai and arrive at the Nile in any condition to fight. With them, the impossible became merely extremely difficult. It is worth noting that this preparation alone took years, a fact that tells you something about how seriously Esarhaddon took the challenge he was setting himself. He also spent years building military infrastructure in the Levant, establishing forward supply depots and pacifying the territories between Assyria and the Egyptian border. By 671 BC, Esarhaddon believed he had done everything that could be done to make the crossing survivable. He ordered the army to march. The march across the Sinai was exactly as difficult as everyone who had warned against it said it would be. The Assyrian annals record the crossing with unusual frankness, noting the lack of water, the extreme heat, and the physical toll on both men and animals. Esarhaddon himself describes the desert in terms that make clear his army was operating at the edge of what was physically sustainable. They moved through terrain where shade did not exist, and where the wrong decision about water management could end an army without a single enemy sword being drawn. The Arab tribal allies who controlled the water sources along the route were, for this campaign, the most important partners Esarhaddon had. Without their cooperation and their knowledge of where drinkable water could be found, the army would have begun dying before it came within sight of Egypt. On the Egyptian side, Taharqa and his advisors were watching the approach and drawing conclusions that would prove dangerously wrong. The assumption in Memphis was that the desert would do what Egyptian armies had not always needed to do: stop the invaders before they arrived. This belief was not irrational. No foreign army of any significant size had ever successfully crossed the Sinai and reached the Nile Delta in living memory. Egypt had relied on this geographic protection for so long that it had become almost an article of faith among the ruling class, rather than a military calculation. There is a particular danger in confusing the historical absence of a threat with the permanent impossibility of one, and Egypt was about to encounter that danger directly. Geography had served as Egypt's first line of defense for generations, and there was every reason to expect it to do so again. But the Assyrians kept moving. Esarhaddon's own inscriptions describe the crossing with a candor unusual for royal records, noting the physical toll and the scarcity of water. He does not claim the desert was easy. He claims his army endured it anyway, which made the achievement more impressive, not less. Day by day, across conditions that would have broken a less disciplined force. The army maintained its cohesion and its direction. The professional training that made Assyrian soldiers effective in conventional battle also made them more resilient in exactly the kind of grinding, attrition-heavy march the Sinai imposed. When the army finally cleared the desert and approached the frontier of Egypt proper, something important had already been established. The assumption on which Egyptian confidence partly rested, that the desert would stop them, had turned out to be false. And Egypt's second line of defense, its military, would now have to answer for what the desert had not. The Assyrian forces that entered the Nile Delta in 671 BC were not an exhausted army stumbling to the finish line after a brutal desert crossing. They were, by the standards of the ancient world, a highly organized fighting force with clear objectives and experienced leadership. Esarhaddon had not simply planned the logistics of getting to Egypt. He had planned what to do once he arrived. Egyptian frontier defenses, which relied on geography to do much of the work, were not structured for this kind of direct, organized assault. The first engagements went badly for Egypt. Taharqa's forces fought. The ancient records on both sides acknowledge that. This was not a campaign that went uncontested. Esarhaddon's own annals record multiple battles in the Delta region, and they record Egyptian resistance as genuine and at points costly. But the fundamental problem Egypt faced was structural, not just military. The Assyrian army was a unified, professionally commanded force operating under a single strategic objective. Egypt's defense was more decentralized, reliant on local commanders, fortress garrisons, and a system designed for defending territory rather than defeating an invader in open battle. That system had worked effectively against the kind of threats Egypt historically faced: regional rivals, local uprisings, raids from the east or south. It was not well suited to absorbing the concentrated, sustained pressure of a professional army with a single clear objective and no intention of stopping between engagements. Each engagement that Egypt lost pushed the Assyrians closer to Memphis, and each step closer to Memphis reduced Egypt's ability to organize a coordinated response. Taharqa understood what was at stake. Memphis was not simply a city. It was the administrative and symbolic heart of the Egyptian state. Whoever held Memphis held the legitimacy that went with it: the temples, the bureaucracy, the royal palace, the connection to the divine authority of the pharaoh. The Assyrian advance accelerated as Egyptian resistance in the Delta began to fracture under the sustained pressure of a force that did not slow down between engagements. Each Egyptian garrison that fell isolated the next one further, removing the possibility of coordinated defense across the Delta. The psychological effect compounded the military one. A defender watching neighboring positions fall has less reason to believe his own will hold. In roughly 2 weeks of fighting, the Assyrians covered the ground from the frontier to the outskirts of Memphis. What had taken months of logistical preparation took days of actual combat to resolve. Esarhaddon ordered the Assyrian siege apparatus deployed without delay: towers, ramps, and battering equipment that had broken walls across Mesopotamia. The defenders of Memphis had presumably prepared for a siege of weeks or months, not one that would be decided in days. Memphis had stood as Egypt's royal capital for most of the past 2 millennia. It was one of the largest and most densely populated cities in the ancient world, protected by walls, by the river, and by centuries of accumulated military investment. Esarhaddon did not intend to wait it out. The Assyrian siege apparatus, refined over generations of campaigning against fortified cities across Mesopotamia and the Levant, was deployed immediately. Towers, ramps, battering equipment. The systematic application of force against the city's defenses by an army that had done this many times before. What followed was, by the standards of ancient siege warfare, remarkably fast. Memphis fell within days of the Assyrian assault beginning, a timeline that shocked contemporaries and that Egyptian strategic planners had clearly not anticipated. The city that had defined Egyptian civilization for 2,000 years was taken by a foreign army in a matter of days. Esarhaddon's annals record what happened next, with the deliberate detail of a ruler who understood the symbolic weight of every action taken in a conquered capital. Members of Taharqa's royal family, including his queen and children, who had not managed to escape, were captured and taken as prisoners. The royal treasury, the storehouses, the temples, all were seized and inventoried by Assyrian officials who moved through the city with practiced efficiency. Taharqa himself escaped, retreating south before the city fell, moving toward his Kushite homeland and the forces still loyal to him there. His escape was strategically significant. Egypt had lost its capital, but its pharaoh was alive, free, and still commanding an army. Esarhaddon declared total victory, took the title of Pharaoh of Egypt, and installed Assyrian officials and loyal local governors to administer the conquered territory. On the surface, the campaign had achieved every objective it had been designed to achieve. Esarhaddon's declaration of total victory turned out to be premature. Taharqa retreated south to Nubia, where his Kushite power base was intact, and his legitimacy as pharaoh remained uncontested. He spent the following years doing exactly what a deposed ruler with resources and determination does. He rebuilt. Fresh troops were recruited and organized. Old alliances with local Egyptian elites were renewed or renegotiated. And crucially, those local elites in the Delta and throughout northern Egypt were not uniformly loyal to their new Assyrian overseers. Many of them had tolerated Assyrian authority as a temporary condition imposed by military defeat, not as a permanent political reality they accepted. The moment Egyptian resistance showed signs of coherence again, the calculations of those local officials began shifting accordingly. Governing Egypt from Nineveh was not the same thing as actually governing Egypt. The Egyptian administrative system was ancient and deeply ingrained, and it did not simply transfer its loyalty to a new master because a battle had been lost. Local priests, landowners, and officials who had managed Egyptian life for generations continued operating according to the patterns they knew, and those patterns did not include Assyrian authority as a permanent feature. The distance between Assyria's capital and the Nile Delta was enormous, and maintaining effective control across that distance required a level of administrative investment that Assyria was not fully prepared to sustain. The governors and local rulers whom Esarhaddon had installed began receiving approaches from Taharqa's agents, who offered something Assyrian rule could not: the restoration of traditional Egyptian authority. Within 2 years of Memphis falling, Taharqa moved north again with a reorganized army and began retaking territory. Assyrian garrisons in the Delta, outnumbered and far from reinforcement, came under sustained pressure. Some of the local governors Esarhaddon had trusted to administer Egypt switched their allegiances back to Taharqa when it became clear that Assyria could not respond quickly enough. Esarhaddon prepared a second invasion to crush the reconstituted Egyptian resistance, but he died on the march before reaching Egypt. The problem he had created, a partially conquered Egypt that refused to stay conquered, fell to his successor. Ashurbanipal, who succeeded his father Esarhaddon, was in many respects the most culturally sophisticated ruler Assyria ever produced. He built the Great Library at Nineveh, one of the largest collections of written knowledge assembled anywhere in the ancient world up to that point. He was also utterly ruthless when it came to maintaining Assyrian power, and Egypt's continuing resistance was a direct challenge to that power. Ashurbanipal conducted not one but two major military campaigns against Egypt, each one more decisive than the last. The first, around 667 BC, drove Taharqa out of Memphis again, this time more completely than Esarhaddon had managed. Taharqa retreated south again, and this time the Assyrian pursuit was more thorough and the political reorganization of Egypt more systematic. The local governors who had switched sides were punished selectively, a calculated message about the consequences of unreliable loyalty. Taharqa died in 664 BC, never having recovered Egypt from Assyrian control, passing both his throne and his unfinished war to his nephew Tantamani. Tantamani made one final major effort, retaking Memphis briefly and executing an Assyrian-aligned governor in a bold assertion of Egyptian sovereignty. Ashurbanipal's response was swift, organized, and went further south than any Assyrian army had ever gone before. He drove Tantamani out of Memphis, out of the Delta, and continued pushing south all the way to Thebes. Thebes, the ancient religious capital of Egypt, the city of Amun, the symbolic heart of Egyptian civilization's deepest traditions, was looted. The temples were stripped, the statues were taken. The accumulated wealth of one of the most sacred cities in the ancient world was loaded onto Assyrian carts heading north. The looting of Thebes was not simply a military act. It was a deliberate statement about what resistance to Assyrian authority ultimately cost. The biblical book of Nahum, written roughly a generation later, uses the fall of Thebes as its benchmark for catastrophic destruction, the thing you reached for when you needed an image of total defeat. For ancient audiences across the Near East who encountered that reference, no further explanation was necessary, which tells you something about how widely the news of Thebes had traveled. A city so holy, so ancient, and so embedded in the region's cultural memory, had been stripped bare by foreign soldiers. Its sacred spaces were treated as simply another category of inventory to be catalogued, loaded, and transported north to Nineveh. Egypt would not be genuinely free of Assyrian pressure for another decade, and when freedom came, it came not from Egyptian military resurgence, but from Assyria's own internal collapse. The consequences of the Assyrian campaigns against Egypt were real, lasting, and genuinely transformative for the balance of power across the ancient Near East. Egypt lost its influence in the Levant, the network of city-states and trading relationships that had given the pharaohs their reach and their resources beyond the Nile Valley. That influence would never fully return, and the loss of it marked a permanent shift in Egypt's role from regional hegemon to defensive power. Assyria, for a brief and violent period, became the undisputed master of the Near East, controlling a territory that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Libya. No empire in history had controlled that much contiguous territory in that region before. And then, within a few decades, it was over. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes destroyed Nineveh, Assyria's capital, ending the empire in a collapse so rapid that it left contemporaries struggling to explain it. The city that had served as the administrative center of the largest empire the ancient Near East had ever seen was burned and abandoned within a few years of Ashurbanipal's death. Subsequent generations of scholars and rulers would study Assyria's fall the way they studied its rise. as evidence that the most powerful structures in history are not necessarily the most durable ones. The empire that had seemed invincible, that had looted Thebes and humiliated Egypt, simply ceased to exist within a generation of its greatest conquests. Egypt survived. Assyria did not. And there is something in that reversal that deserves to be taken seriously. Empires built primarily on the application of overwhelming force tend to be vulnerable at precisely the moment their force appears most overwhelming. The very aggression that let Assyria conquer Egypt also generated the enemies, the resentments, and the coalitions that eventually destroyed it. Egypt, diminished and stripped of its imperial reach, still had the Nile, still had its agricultural base, still had a cultural and religious identity thousands of years in the making. Those things were harder to destroy than a capital city. Civilizations built on deep cultural roots and a reliable agricultural base tend to outlast civilizations built primarily on military expansion, and Egypt was the clearest possible demonstration of that principle. When the Assyrian Empire disappeared, Egypt continued producing pharaohs, building temples, writing in hieroglyphs, and maintaining the rhythms of Nile civilization for another 600 years. Taharqa, the pharaoh who lost Memphis, is today remembered as one of the most significant rulers of the Kushite dynasty, a man who built more than he lost. The temples he constructed, the religious programs he funded, and the administrative networks he maintained outlasted every Assyrian official who ever set foot in Egypt. Esarhaddon's victory was real, but it was also shallow. A military fact that rested on no cultural foundation and generated no lasting loyalty. That shallowness is what Taharqa and then the later Egyptian dynasties were able to exploit when Assyrian attention was drawn elsewhere. Esarhaddon, the king who conquered him, is remembered mainly as a footnote in Egyptian history and a conqueror whose empire did not outlast his grandchildren.